So maybe we have no other choice but to do whatever America wants. Historically, one of the things of being a great power is that you exercise your own ability to decide what is in your country's interest, but also in the interest of the region as a whole.
You've put your finger on one of the particular problems and challenges in foreign policy, which is that he wants to be a messiah. He wants to be the Nye Bevan of net zero. Welcome to Quite Right, the Spectator's podcast with me, Michael Gove, editor of The Spectator.
And me, Madeline Grant, assistant editor and parliamentary sketch writer.
And this week, we'll be looking at the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. We'll be reflecting on what it reveals about British foreign policy, and we'll also be asking, with energy at the heart of our economic debate, why on earth is Ed Miliband still in charge of our energy policy? Westminster is still convulsed by what Britain's stance and posture should be in the war in the Middle East. The debate within the UK, I think, has exposed various fault lines on both left and right about what Britain's foreign policy posture should be. So strikingly, at the weekend, Tony Blair was recorded as having said that our principal ally was America. If America acted, you should show up. That was the pole around which all foreign policy decisions, if you're the UK, should be decided. There's quite a lot of pushback against that, not least because of memories of the Iraq War. And Maddie, I think that you would probably reject not just that principle, not just Blair himself, but also the idea that the UK should be subservient to anyone or anything in foreign policy.
Well, in an ideal world, I would love us to be able to operate from a position of strength with recourse to our national interests. But I think that in some ways what the Prime Minister has done is initially cleave to one path and annoy one group of people, and then U-turn and then get involved to a lesser extent. And in doing so, end up irritating both camps, winding up both groups of people in a way it seems characteristically Starmerist. But on the point about Tony Blair, I mean, I think it's not exactly surprising that he made this intervention. I do worry, though, that in a way our position has already been determined for us by our weakened position. You know, we are not acting from a position of strength. We have such diminished army, navy and air capacity compared to how things have been in decades past. And I think this crisis has really exposed in a visceral way just how weakened our position. So maybe we have no other choice but to do whatever America wants. And, you know, whoever is in charge in the years to come, if they don't make it their business to turn that around and explain to the country what they plan to do about it, well, I think, you know, we have essentially made our bed.
Yes, we have, because the price of our continued, we think influence, some might say grandeur, but certainly status, the price of our status internationally is actually bought through collaboration with the United States, principally. This, I think, is what Tony Blair was really driving at. And I suppose one of the things that he would say is, okay, if you want to be entirely independent in foreign policy terms, if you want to be ultra-Gaullist, if you want to take a realist stance of a particular kind, that's fine, but who's going to protect your bases abroad if you can't? Who is going to service your independent nuclear deterrent? It's not that independent. Who's going to service your nuclear deterrent? Who's going to provide the kit that is necessary in order to maintain your aircraft carriers and so on, if not the US? If you want to divorce yourself from America, fine, go ahead, but you will find that your status is diminished overall and your capacity to achieve other things is diminished overall. But then some others will say, well, actually, do you know what? America exercises this control over us, or this coercive or influential power. What do we get for it? What does Britain get during the Falklands conflict? And it's also been the case from Suez beforehand to the invasion of Grenada without appropriate consultation beforehand, that you see America pursuing its national interest come what may, and regarding Britain as, you know, there to either acquiesce, provide a fig leaf, or to jog along as a sort of more or less helpful elf, and that's no position for an independent nation to take.
And I guess the counterpoint to what Tony Blair is arguing is, has there been a massive comeuppance for the countries that haven't followed America in whatever it was doing? For example, did France see a comeuppance for not participating in the Iraq War? I mean, I could be wrong. You will know a lot more about this period than me.
No.
I was very young when it was happening. But I don't seem to see, France being kind of ostracised by American diplomats, for example, or there being a material comeuppance. Meanwhile, we who did follow America into two conflicts in that troubled part of the world, at the end of the day, President Obama was still willing to say, you're at the back of the queue for any trade deal. We've still had our war dead repeatedly insulted by American lawmakers. So I have to wonder, well, what does non-acquiescence look like if this is the price of acquiescence?
Now, the natural feeling of many would be that Britain and America have allied interests in so many ways that certainly 20 years ago you would have said freedom of navigation, free trade, support for democratizing regimes, support for the rule of law as basically understood, support for Western values in their broadest sense. But it's more difficult to sustain that argument now. That's why I think there is an increasing salience of what one might call a more realist argument. That realist argument, if it becomes reflexively anti-American, I think is as foolish, if not more foolish, than slavish pro-Americanism. But if you are going to take a more realist stance, then you've got to be clear that the extent to which you can achieve your aims depends on your own economic and military strength. And that gets to the heart of Britain's weakness at the moment.
But I also think it's fair to say that we should always follow what our interests are, which will often be shared with our allies. But sometimes the incentives will be very different. For example, the incentives when it comes to intervention in the Middle East, there are very different consequences for Europe compared to America. Obviously, if we turn Libya into a failed state and Libya becomes the conduit for all African migrants to then head towards the continent of Europe,
Yes.
that has very clear real-world consequences for us that aren't going to be experienced by ordinary Americans. I think that is really important to bear in mind. It's the equivalent of like a luxury belief in some cases for a hawkish American, because it's kind of not a million miles away from when some celebrity who lives in a gated community says, let's abolish the police.
Yes.
We're the ones that have to pick up the slack from these interventions.
That is
and I'm
true.
really surprised actually that with that in mind, that Reform UK seem to be adopting, and in fact much of the British right seem to be adopting a policy of backing escalation in the region, never mind just a purely defensive strike, but a kind of something that could lead to escalating when there is an inevitable side effect or quite very likely side effect of more refugees. If controlling immigration is, as you see it, the big existential crisis for our country, for the British state in the next decade, then why would you want to engage in something that will at best make that task more difficult and at worst make it impossible?
Well, it's interesting that you mention reform, because I think all of the political parties have tensions within them. Funnily enough, the parties that have the least divisions on this area are, at the moment, the Greens, the Lib Dems and the Conservatives. It's Reform and Labour that are more interesting in terms of divisions. Obviously, we've seen the divisions within the government laid out through Tim Shipman's amazing reporting from inside the National Security Council, showing the divisions between...
Which no one has denied.
No one's denied. Between, the Miliband faction and the sort of Starmer-Healy faction, between the cautious, sceptical of intervention left and the slightly more interventionist trad right of Labour. But in Reform, you have a curious situation whereby Nigel Farage was gung-ho initially. Robert Jenrick, both speaking at the weekend and then writing in the Telegraph, has struck a much more cautious note and has said, no, we shouldn't get involved. We should certainly, offer support to America by letting them use the bases, but we certainly shouldn't get involved in this war because it will lead, as you pointed out, to inevitable migratory flows later if chaos carries on. But you've also had Nadim Zahawi, who is in this sort of oscillating space between general reform recruit and wannabe reform Foreign Secretary, saying that we should escalate. Nadim, of course, very sort of sympathetic to the position of the Kurds in Iran and to the interests of the United Arab Emirates. You've also had Richard Tice and Andrea Jenkins taking that hawkish line, whereas I think Robert Jenrick's more cautious line probably reflects what a number of reform voters would think, which is this is another foreign dispute that, if it ends up on our shores, will only end up with us paying more.
Although I understood it that there is greater support amongst reform voters for these actions in the short term than any other political group, according to 2024 voting intention, which I accept is perhaps different to, it's not as clear cut today. I mean, I think the history of foreign intervention, especially in the Middle East and around and the environs, suggests that often people support something at the beginning, they come to regret it. I think it can be a real misnomer and short-sighted to simply look at what the opinion polls say on this particular day and try to judge the wisdom of engaging long-term in a very unpredictable part of the world.
I think that is completely right. You're right to correct me that the opinion polls suggest that insofar as one can draw conclusions from them, and one has to be tentative, you're right, they do suggest that reform voters are amongst the most enthusiastic for military action. That did strike me, oddly, as counterintuitive. You know that one knows that reform voters tend to take a more positive view of Trump than the general British public. But my assumption being that the sort of reform base would tend to be, and I don't mean this in a patronising way, would tend to be a bit more isolationist and insular and wary of foreign conflict. And my assumption was that Rob Jenrick spoke for them and that he was trying to draw a contrast between the enthusiasm, undoubted enthusiasm, that the Conservatives have showed for toppling the Iranian regime, but looking at opinion polls and also looking at a conflict when we're only, a fortnight in, less than a fortnight in, and trying to draw conclusions from that, I think you are absolutely right, is dangerous because we've grown used to short, sharp interventions, like the original intervention to deal with Iran's nuclear capability and like the Venezuela intervention. And we forget that the course of a conflict is seldom decided in days, and that public opinion during conflicts can be very mutable, and initial enthusiasm for dealing with an horrific regime can, over time, become not just war weariness, but opposition to the massive sacrifice that conflict requires.
America seems to be adopting a position now that whatever Israel does and whatever Israel considers to be in its interests is automatically in the interests of America and the American people. And which I think is kind of fascinating. We discussed this before, but when Marco Rubio basically said, we're getting involved because the Israelis have decided they're going to go for it, and if we don't follow them, we suspect that we will incur greater losses on our side. I think that, this is an interesting break from even American interventions of yore. For example, America, under Teddy Roosevelt, engages in the Russo-Japanese War primarily to bring an end to that conflict and broker the Treaty of Portsmouth. The idea that you would intervene just purely on the basis of what your ally wants and thinks is in its interest, and I think it's
it took them long enough for the Second World War.
I agree. Israel's interests will often be shared, but they won't always be shared. For example, the destabilization of the Middle East is not in the interests of the religious and ethnic minorities that live there. For example, Israel is currently shelling southern Lebanon, where there are a great many Christian communities, ancient Christian communities. There was, I think, a Catholic village that was destroyed in the last few days, and great loss of life. One of the problems that we have is that we're in a diminished position. Historically, one of the things of being a kind of great power, rather than like the world power, but a great power, is that you exercise your own ability to decide what is in your country's interest, but also in the interest of the region as a whole. And we seem to be completely out of the game altogether. And this is partly a product of the sad reality that we're in.
We know that the attack on Iran is something that Bibi Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, has supported, is intimately involved in. We know that for decades now, he's warned that Iran poses the biggest threat to Israel, and that those who are attacking Israel in the near abroad, Hamas, Hezbollah, etc., are ultimately bankrolled by and answerable to, at least in part, Iran. So we know that Netanyahu would welcome action to decapitate the regime. What hasn't been entirely clear, because there have been conflicting signals, is the extent to which America has been driving this or has been driven by Israel's calculation about what is required to deal with Iran. As you quite rightly point out, Marco Rubio at one stage seemed to suggest that America, if it hadn't been dragged into this conflict, had certainly acted because they knew that Israel was going to act in a particular way. That created a backlash in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, it's the tail wagging the dog, isn't it?
Completely.
Yeah.
And there are a number of people who said either that Rubio misspoke or that he'd been misinterpreted, and that actually the situation was that this was entirely driven by America. Israel was its ally. One of the consequences, though, of the interpretation placed on Rubio's words, perfectly reasonable given what he said, has been that within America, some of Israel's traditional allies have found life more difficult because precisely the point that you make has been made, which is it's good for America to be a steadfast ally of Israel, but it is bad for America to subordinate the timing and the nature of its military strikes to any other country, even if it's one as dear to American hearts as Israel has been. It emphasizes the play of contingency in foreign policy. What do I mean by that? Once you start on a foreign policy initiative, particularly a war, you cannot know how it will end. And while it is undoubtedly the case that from Israel's strategic position, they will be, at the moment, very pleased at the military steps that have been taken to degrade Iran, a price may have been paid in terms of the solidity of future American political support for Israel. Now, Bibi Netanyahu may be prepared to pay that political price in order to secure the elimination of a existential adversary, but we don't know how far America will go, and we don't know if the Iranian regime, even though it's lost a lot of its military capability, will actually fall.
And sometimes I think that conflicts in the Middle East are generally presented to Western audiences as if they are a very straight and simple fight between, for example, Israel versus the mullahs, the Islamists versus our friends, which is not untrue, but it downplays the extent to which there are a whole range of other parties who have whose interests are being subsumed in this kind of this presentation as a straight civilizational fight. I think it's sad that the British right has actually had very little to say about the way that Christians have suffered because of Israel's response over the last few years. And you can believe that Israel steadfastly has a right to defend itself while still calling out examples of overreach.
You've put your finger on one of the particular problems and challenges in foreign policy, which is that there is a restless search to find goodies and baddies, black hats and white hats. You can understand how our politics, left versus right, Labour versus Conservative, proposition versus opposition, entrenches a binary divide. And indeed, that's how arguments need to be made in order to thrash out which course of action to follow. But in the world of foreign policy, it is much more difficult, I believe, to determine who is a permanent goodie and who is a genuine baddie. And in fact, using that prism, it will often lead you into all sorts of difficulties. And within foreign policy, you can have some people who are naturally pro-American, others who are anti-American, those who are pro-intervention abroad, muscular liberals if you prefer, those who take a more restrained, cautious, realist line. But one of the striking things about foreign policy is that you also have people on both left and right who take a crusading point of view, who look beyond our shores and find regimes or forces that they want to support. And then those who actually say, well, we must be prepared in extremis to fight, and we certainly don't want to forfeit allies, but you can't look at how individuals and states behave and put them into the camp of paladins on the one side and pirates on the other. This podcast is sponsored by the new film, October 8. October 8 offers a look at the real-life impacts of the 7th of October on the lives of Jewish people and the eruption of anti-Semitism on college campuses, social media, and in the streets of America, beginning the day after the attack on Israel by Hamas. Through meticulous investigation, the film also uncovers how, over decades, Hamas created sophisticated networks in America to permeate US institutions, and it examines the tsunami of online anti-Semitism and disinformation unleashed by Iran, China, and Russia, all with the goal of dividing American society. This is a vital wake-up call about the threat of extremism against democracy. October 8 is available to buy or rent now on Amazon Prime, Apple TV, and Google.
I'd be really fascinated to hear your thoughts about the prevailing mindset of people who actually dictate our foreign policy, not just the politicians, but, for example, our diplomats. I was really struck by a really interesting interview with Ben Judah, who has just finished working for David Lammy as an advisor. And he was on our podcast, Coffee House, with James Heal and Tim Shipman. They also invited on a guy called Amir Katecha, who recently left the Foreign Office and whistle blew on what he said was a great level of essentially fiddling while Rome burns, lots of kind of woke initiatives while the country is in genuine peril on many fronts. Amir Katecha was saying that the Foreign Office is enthralled to this stuff, even at times of great danger. And Ben Judah, although I think came across as a really intelligent guy, really wanted to do the best for his country, he was still basically saying, no, it's right that we prioritise these things.
Many of the woke initiatives that have the Foreign Office enchanted or entranced are actually initiatives that apply across the civil service. So the emphasis on DEI, the emphasis on how people feel about their work, taking your whole self to work, and so on. There are two additional things that affect the Foreign Office beyond general civil service touchy-feely wokeness. One is that the DEI emphasis and the inclusivity emphasis has meant that there has been a less rigorous approach towards deep knowledge, particularly deep language knowledge. And so recruitment into the FCDO has been explicitly less elitist than it used to be.
Yes, and you may not like them, but the posh kids tend to be quite good at doing foreign languages.
And also, there's a big question about foreign language teaching in this country, to which I hope we'll return. You will want people who have that foreign language facility, and it is the case that particularly people from elite universities, whatever school they've gone to, who are possessed of strong language skills, have found it more difficult to get recruited by the Foreign Office, and our reporter John Conley's been investigating this. The second thing is that there are two government departments, at least two government departments, that tend to, or have tended to attract the ethical activist, the social justice warrior. And they were the Energy Department, which has attracted climate change enthusiasts, i.e. those opposed to climate change, green enthusiasts, eco-zealots. The other department that used to attract people with a strong crusading zeal was the Department for International Development. If you were the sort of person who thought of themselves potentially as a saviour, white or otherwise, then DFID was the place to be. Boris hated the culture in DFID. He absorbed DFID into the Foreign Office, thinking that the Foreign Office would put manners on the DFID zealots and that the superior Mandarin intellects would prevail. Actually, it's been more like a reverse takeover.
That's interesting.
And the Foreign Office has become far more like a super department for international
And when
development.
did the merger happen?
It happened when Boris was Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Because he'd been struck when he was Foreign Secretary that whenever he went, for example, to any part of what we now call the Global South, the diplomat was a smart man or woman in slightly fly-blown circumstances, but the DFID operatives were the ones with the 4x4s, the cash, and the ability to forge connections. And he thought, this is insane that our diplomat, who's reflecting the full range of our national interests, is almost regarded as an ornament here.
Yes.
And the aid guys are the people with the open checkbooks, and they're the ones who get listened to.
And it's right that should be under the umbrella of what's
totally.
in our national interest. And it's right that the Foreign Office have those tools at their disposal.
Yeah, I know. I think
the
that
two
Boris's
are inextricably linked. Yeah.
I think Boris's judgment that they should come together was absolutely right. The problem was that, as I say, DFID mounted a sort of reverse takeover, though my understanding is that the new permanent secretary at the Foreign Office has been aware of this and has attempted a sort of shakeout or a reordering to bring the Foreign Office back to a situation where there's a greater degree of primacy of traditional diplomacy and domain knowledge.
Yes.
But the cultural drift that Amir Katecha described was taking place. But I think, as I say, the new permanent secretary at the Foreign Office has tackled that at a deep level.
How widespread is the general view, for example, the view famously expressed by Gus O'Donnell, formerly the UK's most senior civil servant, that his job was to, quote, maximise global welfare, not national welfare? Without naming any names, I once met one of our former ambassadors to Russia in a private function. And this person, when they learned that I worked at the time at the Daily Telegraph, just had a go at me for what they perceived to be our irresponsible coverage of net zero. You know, even though I would argue that our slavish devotion to net zero, perhaps more than any other country, and I think we're going to talk about this in more detail shortly, has left us more exposed to the shocks caused by global instability. But it's just, I wonder how widespread these sorts of views are. I suspect more than we might like to think.
I think they are there, and they're there for a couple of reasons. So there is the team DFID mentality that I mentioned earlier, that Britain's global leadership comes not from the fact that we may have the best industry, the best GDP, or the strongest armed forces. Britain's global leadership, and Britain should exercise global leadership, comes from the amount that we spend on international development or our leadership in climate mitigation and adaptation. So we may no longer be able to rule the waves and recognize that our dreadnoughts can subdue the natives in distant lands. But what we can do is that we can awe the natives in distant lands with the speed of our adoption of solar technology, or the success of our wind farms, or our commitment to providing them with financial support for the loss and damage that climate change has wrought over time. So there is still this sense of need for us to demonstrate our leadership. And then in that sense, you would have been, with your ridiculous petty interest in sums adding up, science and rational energy policy, you would have been a pathetic little Englander standing in the way of a greater Britain meeting its climate destiny.
Can I just say one more thing about soft power before we move on? As I remember, it was George Osborne was responsible, I think, for selling off a lot of sort of foreign residences that belonged to our diplomats. I would argue, I know sums adding up is important, and I understand that, you know, terrible financial situation was what awaited George Osborne as he entered the Treasury. But I would argue that having essentially a mansion in a foreign country where your dignitaries can entertain influential people in that country, and where actually an invitation from, say, the High Commissioner of wherever still actually does carry a lot of clout. People may think this is a terrible hangover of empire, but I think it still does retain some power. That is what actual soft power looks like, not, you know, effing Paddington. And we've done this to ourselves.
It was the case that the Foreign Office were subject, when George was Chancellor, to cost-cutting measures. Actually, much less, merely because he was mates with William Hague, than other government departments. And so there was some rationalisation, horrible word, of the Foreign
You're not
Office
a politician
estate.
anymore, Michael.
No, I'm sorry.
You don't have to say these things.
Sell off.
You can say problems, not challenges, if you want.
Yeah, no, but there was some flogging off of top-flight properties. Not that much.
No.
But one of the reasons why it became particularly pernicious is that you had the alliance of the accountants and the wokesters, always terrible. And the wokesters loved the idea, exactly as you say, that we could get rid of imposing colonialist buildings, which were uncomfortable reminders of our imperial past. And while there are lots and lots of wonderful people in the Foreign Office who are very proud of Britain's history and traditions, it was also the case that, for example, whenever people raised the question of mentioning the human rights of people in Zimbabwe, it would always be the case that there would be someone from the Foreign Office saying, well, we don't really have any sort of, legitimacy in this area. They won't listen because of our colonial past.
Yes.
I shan't repeat now what I said then.
Ed Miliband has been in the news a lot in recent days because of the looming energy crisis, our ill preparedness for it, and also the revelation that Ed Miliband was one of the ministers influential in persuading Keir Starmer not to allow America to launch their strikes from our bases. We ran a leader in the magazine last week with the headline, Ed Miliband must go. Perhaps you could elaborate a little on that.
Ed Miliband is one of the two most intelligent people in the cabinet. He's one of the most experienced ministers that they have. He hit the ground running as minister, and he has a formidable grip over his department. All of that sounds great, and it would be great if the policies he was pursuing were sensible. But in fact, the policies he's pursuing are destroying this country's economy, making sure that the last of our manufacturing sector is impeding our adoption of artificial intelligence and new technology, and in pursuit, with an almost fundamentalist zeal of making Britain the world's leader in decarbonising our economy, he is in the process destroying our economy. And that's why I felt that it was appropriate that at a time when war in the Middle East was drawing everyone's attention to energy prices and to energy policy, that the Spectator should, as it always has done, be clear about the threats to the country from within.
So in Ed Miliband, you have the uniquely terrible set of circumstances of an actually competent person who's extremely good at enacting terrible ideas.
Yes.
Yes. And he's also, I think, important to say, very internally popular within the Labour Party. Polls suggest, actually, that if he were to be the candidate, he would be the favoured choice to replace Keir Starmer as Labour leader. I'm not convinced that he himself wants to run that gauntlet again, having had a pretty torrid time of it when he was Labour leader last time. But I think it certainly gives him perhaps outsized influence within the party, and he's one of those ministers that has always withstood any kind of reshuffle that's been going on.
He is the safe choice. He is the safe pash for the Labour Party membership, because he was rejected last time round, so he's unlikely to put himself forward again for Labour leader. So it's all right to fantasise about him if you're a Labour Party member. In that sense, he's like a curate in a Barbara Pym novel. He appears to be the perfect husband, but there is no risk of him actually proposing. And why does he appear so perfect? Because he always opposed the Iraq War, because he suffered for Labour by being the leader who was humiliated, because he stuck it out, and then because there is a cause which he defends with intellectual vigour, which is, if you're on the, well, you don't need to be on the left, actually, which can be seen as a noble cause, and a noble cause which he underpins with, the skill of an Oxford PPE graduate in using economic arguments which carry you only so far, but carry you far enough to outwit most interviewers.
I would say there was and remains something quite tasteless about the way that Ed Miliband made the case for non-intervention. It was incredibly self-aggrandising. To me, the decision of whatever you do, it's going to be very painful for some people. It's a case of, do the potential downside outweigh the gains? That does not mean that it should be an opportunity for the leader at the time to kind of self-aggrandise. I remember they cheered him as he came back to the PLP after voting down the strikes. It was all about Syria, me. So, sorry, I should have explained in more detail what I was talking about. And you almost wonder if, having got a little high on his own supply last time, he therefore feels emboldened to say to Keir Starmer, we can't even let America use these bases.
I think that's true. But I think that his intervention at the National Security Council to say, hold on a moment, let's not be an unquestioning ally of America, I think in its own terms, while I disagree with him, I think is
reasonable.
It's reasonable.
Yes.
It's reasonable. But you draw attention to the most significant thing about his non-interventionism, which is not the policy position, it's the self-aggrandizing element. I remember talking to someone who had served alongside Ed Miliband in government, and I said, what really drives him? And this person said, he wants to be a messiah. The individual concerned didn't then say, but he's actually just
Very
a naughty
boy.
But he said that what Ed Miliband would love is to have, as Jeremy Corbyn did, everyone at Glastonbury chanting his name. He wants to be a moral leader as much as he wants to be a national leader. And he wants to be the Nye Bevan of net zero. And in the same way as Aneurin Bevan has this hallowed place in Labour mythology as the founder of the National Health Service, Ed Miliband wants to be remembered as the person who banished the wickedness of fossil fuels from our economy and took us to a wind and solar-powered nirvana. Ed Miliband believes his own propaganda. He believes that this would actually make the country energy secure, but what he really wants to do is to be remembered as the Messiah whom Saint Greta foresaw the arrival of.
Well, in the same way that Tony Blair said that it was speaking to God that prompted him to engage in Iraq. I think there is a messianic quality to Ed Miliband for sure, but where it really begins to unravel is in the manifest insanity of what he's arguing for. We've not reached a place where we can divest ourselves of fossil fuels. All that we've done is we now, I think, import between about 45% of our natural gas now comes from Norway, small amount from Qatar, and obviously we get LNG from America. We haven't, it makes no sense to ban your exploration of your own oil and gas resources so long as you're continuing to export from abroad. All that you've done is outsource it and actually add to the emissions because of the cost and the energy of transporting it. So by his own terms, Ed Miliband is not succeeding. It's an example of the pure gesture politics that I think has taken over much of our governing class, like something that you cannot explain to anyone. You cannot steelman this in a way that has any rational reasoning to it at all. No, but still they do it.
They still do it. And you have government ministers who will blithely say, when asked about it, they've got one or two lines of defence. They'll say, look, this conflict just proves how you can't rely on oil and gas and how much better it would be if we developed our renewables. But what they very rarely acknowledge is that even on the most optimistic scenario, we will still need oil and gas for many years to come. Secondly, that sometimes the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, so you need a base load, and that can't be provided just by nuclear power alone. So even in the most optimistic scenario, Ed Miliband is envisaging reliance on gas power for a long time to come. That makes it all the crazier, as you say, that we should be completely reliant on other countries for that supply. When we have oil and gas resources in the North Sea, not to mention, obviously, the prospect of fracking, which I know is controversial, but even if you put fracking aside, in the North Sea, and Norway is exploiting them while we don't. Yes. It's literally the case that there is liquid and aerated gold, as it were, beneath our feet and beneath the waves, and yet we deny ourselves the opportunity to take advantage of it. And all the while, our steel, ceramics, and other energy-intensive manufacturing industry, chemicals particularly, suffer.
I mean, this is where I think the vanity and ego point comes in. In the last 10 years, I think the number of well-paid, decent jobs associated with North Sea oil have more than halved.
Yes.
So, real people have lost their sources of income. And despite the promises of Miliband and his friends, they have not been replaced by jobs of equal value in green energy. What's more, there was often, I remember, spoken of around the time that net zero was pushed through the Commons without any vote at the end, in the dying days of Theresa May's time in office. It was said that this would confer a kind of first mover advantage on Britain because we were the first to commit. We would therefore reap the benefits of all this new technology and therefore we would profit from it. I don't really see a great deal of evidence that this has happened because in terms of first mover advantage, we now have some of the highest industrial and domestic energy prices in the world. What rational country would wish to follow our example?
Two things. One of the few people in Parliament who raised concerns about this, not me, was Kemi Badenoch. It is striking that she did at the time. She was ahead of her time in doing so. The second thing is, it is the case that it is possible when there is energy innovation to secure advantage for yourself from it. But most of the advantage in solar and wind has gone to Denmark, China, and to other jurisdictions rather than to UK. The area where we do have a residual strength, the oil and gas sector, can play a part in carbon capture and storage and some of the new technologies. But in order to do so, it needs to continue to make money. What Ed Miliband's policy has done is basically to kill that sector's capacity to adapt to the future.
Last year, for the first time, I think since the 60s, there were no exploratory oil wells were drilled.
Exactly.
And in the same year, I think Norway made £50 billion or thereabouts from extracting its own oil and gas.
Yes, and it is not as though Norway is run by ayatollahs and greedheads. You know, it is one of the most socially democratic, progressive, depending on your point of view, countries in the world. So it's not as though we're comparing ourselves with a petrostate run by J.R. Ewing. It's Norway, which makes it all the more absurd. Now, of course, I have a very small Highland Terrier in this fight because many of the jobs that are in the oil and gas sector are in my home city of Aberdeen. So I'm biased, but I know from the conversations that I have had with people in that sector, including conversations that I had in government, that they recognise that oil and gas will be a diminishing part of the energy mix over time. They completely recognise that. What they want is two things: a staged transition that allows them to continue to be able to take advantage of some of the residual stock out there, but also they want to be able to do so in a way that allows their technology and their capital to be repurposed for new opportunities, including in the world of renewables. But again, their capital is being sacrificed, their flesh is being mortified, as it were, by Ed Miliband. And it's not just that sector that complains. If you talk to people responsible for energy distribution, who have to change the way in which our energy supply operates as well, they also say that they're ready for change, but the pace at which Ed Miliband is demanding that change to meet an almost millennialist deadline. Millenarian, you're right.
Yeah.
Is too difficult for them.
Well, I think this is the point. If you're, for example, a reporter or even a politician who says, you know, I'm actually not against the principle of net zero. I'm not against the world using the best of technology and harnessing the best of global talent to figure out a solution to man-made climate change. That's one thing. No. But then you've got that, which I think is perfectly fair. And then on the other hand, you have Ed Miliband, who says, well, actually, even though we don't have the technology ready to replace it, even though we are continuing to use fossil fuels, for the sake of my own ideological purity, they must not have come from our own resources.
No.
So I think that is actually impossible for anyone to defend so long as we continue to import.
Completely.
And it tells you something very important about the prevailing mindset.
Totally. So in order to feed the world in the future, I'm sure it will be the case that there will be, and some people might shiver at the thought, more lab-grown meat. It will be the case that there will be gene editing of plants in order to increase yield. I think that innovation should be explored. I think there is a potential boon there.
And nuclear as well.
And nuclear.
Advances in nuclear energy.
All of which will be good things. But I wouldn't say, well, because that's on the horizon, let's shoot every cow now and let's uproot our current crops because, they rely too much on fertilizer we can't afford. It would be crazy. I mean, farmers may write in and say that actually this government is already destroying our farming sector, but it would be crazy to destroy our farming sector because of the prospect of technological nirvana around the corner. In the same way, it's mad to give up the energy resources that we have at our feet because of the way in which technology might alter things And certainly the planet might benefit, but the planet will only benefit if we also have the economic growth to be able to invest
Yes.
in adaptation to new ways of working.
And what people of Ed Miliband's mindset forget is that the universe actually is very agnostic as to where the emissions are coming from.
Totally.
You know, if Britain decides that it will, well, actually not necessarily always reduce its supply of fossil fuels, but it will simply offshore it to a different country. But meanwhile, other countries continue to fill their boots. So Matt Ridley makes the interesting point that imagine if Britain were to immiserate itself and actually succeeded in getting to net zero emissions by 2050. And then in 2051, some incredible new technology comes along that has the capacity to achieve this without the hair-shirting debasement that we had to go through. I mean, imagine how stupid that we would feel then.
Well, quite. And I thought one of the things that was very significant is that the holy father of centrist dads, the Pope of moderation, Martin Wolf of the FT, was writing just last week that given that we, the UK, are responsible for only 0.8% of global emissions, surely it would be eccentric for us to believe that we would exercise decisive global leadership by pursuing an energy policy that was self-mortifying. Now, if Martin Wolf is no longer prepared to indulge the benefit of the doubt on your behalf, then you have lost the room. If Pinkham is no longer prepared to support Miliband's energy policy, then all that remains to him, but it may be enough, is the adulation of Labour's continuing hardcore members.